Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. Here is a paradox that has puzzled scholars for centuries. The very first cities, built by humanity's earliest civilizations, were not dedicated to human rulers or earthly concerns, but to beings that had never walked the earth. Before humans developed the wheel, before they discovered bronze, before they could even agree on standardized measurements, they were already building massive temple complexes for invisible powers. The Mesopotamians, dwelling in a land with no stone, little wood, and precious few natural resources, chose to devote their most monumental efforts, not to palaces or fortresses, but to houses for the gods. And perhaps most remarkably, these gods they served so devotedly were not gentle protectors or benevolent parents, but forces of cosmic terror, beings who viewed humanity with the same casual indifference we might show to ants beneath our feet. Tonight, we will journey into this divine realm that shaped human consciousness for over 3,000 years. We will explore the complex pantheon that emerged between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where gods were born from primordial waters and where divine family dramas determined the fate of nations. Our journey will take us from the silent darkness before creation, through the great wars of heaven, into the underworld's 7 gates, and finally, to the echoes these ancient deities still cast in our modern world. Before we get started, your like and subscription would mean the world to me. It's what keeps this channel alive and thriving. I'm continuously amazed by our international audience, so I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what's the time where you are? 0, 5. Feel the present gently dissolve as history opens its arms to welcome you into a land of reed marshes and mud brick cities, where the air shimmers with heat and divine presence. You are standing on the alluvial plains of ancient Sumer, perhaps in the year 3000 BC, where the horizon stretches endlessly in all directions, broken only by the towering ziggurats that rise like mountains from the flat earth. The evening air carries the scent of burning cedar from temple braziers, mixing with the earthier smell of river mud and date palm blossoms. Listen carefully, and you can hear the distant sound of temple drums, calling the faithful to witness the feeding of the gods, a ritual as essential as the rising of the Sunday. Here, in this landscape where the boundary between divine and mortal was as fluid as the rivers that gave it life, humanity first attempted to understand the cosmic forces that controlled their destiny. Here, where every thunderstorm might signal divine anger and every good harvest divine approval, the gods were not distant philosophical concepts, but immediate demanding presences who required constant attention, negotiation, and appeasement. Part 1. Origins and Cosmic Context. The primordial waters, before creation. Before there were gods with names and faces, before the first temple stone was laid, before even the concept of worship existed, there was water. Not the water we know, confined to rivers and seas, but an infinite expanse of primordial fluid that existed without boundary or definition. The ancient Mesopotamians understood something profound that modern cosmology has only recently rediscovered, that in the beginning there was no separation, no distinction, only a vast unity waiting to be divided. In the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, this primeval state has a name, or rather, 2 names. Apsu, the male principle, embodied the sweet waters that would one day flow beneath the earth and bubble up in springs and wells. His essence was potential, the possibility of life that fresh water represents in a desert landscape. Imagine standing beside a Mesopotamian well at dawn, watching the first bucket drawn up, the water catching the early light like liquid silver, that glimpse of life-giving sweetness rising from hidden depths. That was Apsu's domain. His consort, Tiamat, was something far more terrible and magnificent. She was the salt water, the primordial ocean, vast and unknowable. Her body contained all the chaos that would later be separated into ordered existence. The Mesopotamians described this initial state not as emptiness, but as a mingling, a cosmic embrace between these 2 watery powers. There was no sky above or earth below, no light or darkness as we understand them. The very concepts of up and down, day and night, had not yet been born. This was not nothingness, but rather everything, compressed into an undifferentiated whole. The ancient texts speak of this time with a curious mixture of reverence and unease, as if the scribes themselves could barely comprehend a reality without the basic structures that define existence. What makes the Mesopotamian vision unique among ancient creation stories is its fundamentally aquatic nature. While the Egyptians began with a primordial mound rising from waters, and the Greeks started with chaos and void, the Mesopotamians insisted that water itself was the source and substance of everything. This was not merely poetic metaphor, but practical theology for a people whose entire civilization depended on the annual flooding of two great rivers. Every spring, when the Tigris and Euphrates overflowed their banks, turning the land into a temporary sea of mud and silt, the Mesopotamians witnessed a small-scale reenactment of that primordial state. The boundary between land and water dissolved, and for a brief time, their ordered world returned to something resembling that ancient chaos. Yet Apsu and Tiamat were not merely cosmic principles or abstract forces. The texts grant them personality, desire, and most remarkably, the capacity for irritation. For in this perfect stillness, in this eternal embrace of waters, something began to stir. The mingling of Apsu and Tiamat generated movement, and movement generated form, and form generated the first emanations of what would become gods. These were not created deliberately, not crafted with purpose as humans would later be, but emerged spontaneously from the interaction of the primordial waters, like bubbles rising from the depths, like whirlpools forming where currents meet. The first divine beings condensed from the cosmic waters. The ancient scribes who recorded these stories understood something we often forget, that creation is not always a joyous event. Birth involves pain, separation, loss. The emergence of the first gods meant the end of the perfect silence that Apsu treasured. It meant the disruption of Tiamat's vast, undisturbed presence. And so, even in the very beginning, even in the first moment of divine existence, the seeds of conflict were sown. When fresh water met salt, the birth of everything, the moment when Apsu's fresh waters first mingled with Tiamat's salty depths marked the beginning of time itself, though time as a concept did not yet exist to measure it. The Mesopotamian priests, standing in their temple chambers, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on mud brick walls, would recite this cosmic genealogy with the same precision their contemporaries used to record grain shipments and tax records. They understood that the birth of gods was as real and sequential as the birth of kings. From the mingling of the primordial waters came Lahmu and Lahamu, deities so ancient that even the Babylonians had forgotten their specific functions, remembering only that they were first. These were not fully formed gods, as later generations would understand them, but rather divine principles still half dissolved in the primordial waters. Imagine the first moment when oil is poured into water, those swirling, iridescent patterns that form before separation occurs. Such were these first deities, neither fully separate from their parents, nor entirely subordinate to them. Lamu and Lahamu gave birth to Anshar and Kishar, whose names mean the whole sky and the whole earth, though sky and earth as physical realities did not yet exist. Here we see the Mesopotamian mind at work, understanding that the idea of something must exist before the thing itself can manifest. Anshar and Kishar were the potential for separation, the promise that the mingled waters might one day divide into distinct realms. When a Mesopotamian farmer looked up at the vast dome of the sky or down at the solid earth beneath his feet, he saw the bodies of these ancient gods, still locked in an embrace that defined the very structure of reality. The genealogy continues with mathematical precision, each generation more distinct, more individuated than the last. From Anshar came Anu, who would become the father of the gods, the supreme authority in heaven whose name would be invoked in every treaty, every royal decree, every plea for divine justice. The progression from the formless Apsu to the highly personified Anu represents not just a family tree but an evolution of consciousness itself, from pure being to defined identity. You are a young priest in training at the Temple of Marduk in Babylon, circa 1750 BC. The senior priest has brought you into the inner sanctum just before dawn. The air is thick with myrrh smoke, making your eyes water, and the only light comes from a single brazier that turns everything the colour of burnished copper. He unrolls an ancient tablet, so old that some of the cuneiform marks have begun to fade, and begins to chant the creation story. As his voice rises and falls in the traditional cadence, you can almost see it, the primordial waters separating, like cream rising to the top of milk, the first gods emerging like mist, condensing into solid form. You understand that you are not merely learning mythology, but cosmic law, the fundamental principles that govern everything, from the flooding of the rivers to the movement of the planets. But this cosmic evolution came with a price. Each new generation of gods was more active, more dynamic than their predecessors. Where Apsu valued stillness and silence, these younger deities buzzed with energy and ambition. They gathered in groups, discussing and planning, creating the first sounds to echo through the universe. The noise, we are told, was unbearable to Apsu, not because it was loud by our standards, but because it represented the antithesis of everything he was. Motion against his stillness, complexity against his simplicity, multiplicity against his unity. The text described these young gods with surprising sympathy. They were not malicious in their activity, merely young and alive, doing what living beings do, moving, creating, destroying, experimenting with their newfound existence. They were like children who have just discovered they can make sounds, delighting in every new noise without understanding that somewhere in the house, an ancient presence yearns for the silence that can never return. This tension between the old that seeks preservation and the young that demands change would become the central drama of Mesopotamian mythology and, perhaps, of existence itself. Part 2. Discovery and Transmission. Clay tablets and forgotten languages. For nearly 2,000 years, the gods of Mesopotamia slept beneath the sand, their names unspoken, their stories reduced to strange wedge-shaped marks on broken clay tablets that no living person could read. The great ziggurats had crumbled into formless mounds that local Arabs called tells, never suspecting that beneath these hills lay the remains of humanity's first cities. Then, in the middle of the 1800s, as steam engines transformed the world above ground, a different kind of revolution was beginning in the basements of European museums, where patient scholars were about to break a code that had been unbreakable since the fall of Babylon. The story of how we rediscovered the Mesopotamian gods reads like a detective novel written across centuries. It began with travelers and diplomats bringing back curious souvenirs from the Ottoman Empire, tablets covered in what looked like bird tracks in mud, or perhaps the marks left by reeds pressed into wet clay. These objects gathered dust in private collections and museum storage rooms. Mysterious artifacts from an age that even the Bible described only in fragments. The breakthrough came slowly, then suddenly. In the 1840s, Henry Rawlinson, clinging to a cliff face in Persia, copied the massive Behistun inscription, which contained the same text in 3 different scripts. Like the Rosetta Stone had done for Egyptian hieroglyphics, this trilingual inscription provided the key to cuneiform. Within a decade, scholars across Europe were racing to translate the growing collection of tablets that excavations were unearthing by the thousands. But it was a young man named George Smith, a former banknote engraver, who had taught himself Assyriology by spending his lunch breaks in the British Museum, who would make the discovery that shook Victorian society to its foundations. In 1872, working through a collection of broken tablets from Nineveh, Smith began to piece together a story that seemed impossibly familiar. Here was a great flood, a man warned by a god to build an ark, animals brought aboard 2 by 2, a dove and a raven sent out to find dry land. But this wasn't Noah's story, or rather, it was Noah's story told 1,000 years before the Bible was written, with different names and different gods. Smith became so excited that, according to witnesses, he jumped up from his desk and began removing his clothes, running around the room in a state of scholarly ecstasy that scandalized his Victorian colleagues. The tablet Smith had discovered was part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but more importantly, it proved that the Mesopotamian gods were not mere primitive superstitions but part of a sophisticated theological system that had influenced all subsequent Middle Eastern religions. Suddenly, every museum in Europe and America wanted Mesopotamian artifacts. Excavations at Uruk, Nippur, and Babylon began shipping back tons of tablets, each one a potential window into this lost world. The gods were speaking again, but in a language that had to be painstakingly reconstructed one symbol at a time. Consider the peculiar intimacy of reading these tablets today. When you look at a cuneiform inscription, you are seeing the direct impression of a reed stylus held by a human hand 4,000 years ago. The scribe pressed his tool into wet clay, perhaps pausing occasionally to dip his reed in water to prevent it from sticking, perhaps stopping to massage a cramped hand. These are not copies of copies like most ancient texts that come to us through medieval manuscripts. These are originals, bearing the fingerprints, quite literally sometimes, of the people who created them. One tablet in the British Museum preserves the paw print of a cat that walked across it while the clay was still wet, a moment of domestic chaos frozen in time, reminding us that these texts about cosmic gods were created in very human environments. The process of translation revealed not single, authoritative versions of these myths, but multiple variants, sometimes contradicting each other, sometimes offering entirely different perspectives on the same events. The gods emerged not as monolithic figures, but as complex personalities that evolved over millennia, absorbing attributes from conquered peoples, adapting to new political realities, sometimes even changing gender or fundamental nature. This archaeological resurrection gave us something perhaps more valuable than certainty. It gave us the ability to see how divine stories grow, change, and adapt across time, how gods themselves are living things in the human imagination. The library beneath the sand. 700 years before the birth of Christ, in the city of Nineveh, on the eastern bank of the Tigris River, the most powerful man in the world suffered from a peculiar obsession. Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, ruler of an empire that stretched from Egypt to Iran, spent his nights not counting his gold or planning new conquests, but reading. More specifically, he was building the world's first systematic library, and his chosen subject was the entire knowledge of Mesopotamian civilization, with particular emphasis on the correct forms of addressing, praising, and appeasing the gods. The royal library at Nineveh was not merely a collection but a deliberate act of preservation. Ashurbanipal understood something that many rulers never grasp, that military power is temporary, but knowledge, particularly divine knowledge, might be eternal. He dispatched teams of scribes throughout his empire with a simple command: copy everything. They were to visit every temple library, every private collection, every dusty archive, and make perfect copies of any tablet dealing with religion, ritual, medicine, astronomy, or literature. When copying wasn't sufficient, when he encountered unique or particularly valuable texts, the king simply confiscated the originals. One imagines the horror of provincial priests watching royal agents cart away tablets that had been in their temples for 1,000 years, consoled only by the promise that the king himself would ensure their preservation. The copying process itself was an act of religious devotion. Scribes would begin each day with purification rituals, washing their hands in sacred water, reciting prayers to Nabu, the god of writing. The copying room would be swept clean, the light checked to ensure no shadows would cause misreadings. Then, in absolute silence broken only by the soft scratch of stylus on clay, they would begin their work. Each tablet was checked and double-checked. At the bottom, they would inscribe a colophon, a kind of ancient metadata, recording the source of the text, the name of the scribe, the date of copying, and often a curse against anyone who might damage or steal the tablet. May Ashur and Enlil cast him down in fury and anger, reads one. May they erase his name and his seed from the land. You are standing in the library itself, perhaps in the year 650 BC, when it was at its height. The main reading room stretches before you, lit by oil lamps in wall niches that cast a warm, steady glow. The air smells of sesame oil from the lamps, and the distinctive earthen scent of thousands of clay tablets. They are arranged on wooden shelves, organized by subject and subsubject, in a system so sophisticated that modern libraries still use similar classifications. The silence is profound, broken only by the occasional whisper of a scholar requesting a specific tablet from the library assistants. In the corner, a young scribe is carefully coating a damaged tablet with new clay to preserve the text beneath, a technique that would allow these stories to survive another 2,500 years underground. The library contained over 30,000 tablets including multiple versions of creation myths, detailed instructions for every religious festival, astronomical observations going back centuries, and the complete Epic of Gilgamesh in what scholars consider its standard version. But perhaps most remarkably, it preserved the oral traditions that were already ancient when writing was invented. These stories had been passed down through generations of priests, each trained to memorize vast narratives word for word, intonation by intonation. The commitment to memory was so precise that when multiple written versions were compared, derived from different oral traditions, the variations were minimal, usually matters of dialect rather than substance. This transformation from oral to written tradition changed the very nature of how humans related to their gods. In the oral tradition, stories lived and breathed with each telling, subtly adapting to their audience and circumstances. A skilled priest could emphasize different aspects of Marduk's victory over Tiamat, depending on whether he was addressing soldiers before battle or farmers praying for rain. But once fixed in clay, these stories became canonical, their flexibility traded for permanence. The gods themselves became more fixed, their personalities and attributes standardized across the empire. When Nineveh fell in 612 BC, destroyed by a coalition of its enemies, the palace was burned so thoroughly that the stone walls cracked from the heat. But in one of history's great ironies, this destruction ensured the library's preservation. The fire that was meant to erase Assyrian culture instead baked the clay tablets into near indestructible ceramic. The collapsing roof buried them, and there they waited, the gods sleeping in their clay beds, until British excavators in the 1850s began to unearth them, finding them stacked like ancient newspapers, ready to tell their stories once again. Part 3. The Pantheon and Cosmology. The Seven Who Decree Fate. Above the chaos of divine genealogies and regional variations, above the thousands of minor deities who governed everything from brick-making to beer brewing, stood seven figures whose authority was absolute. The Mesopotamians called them the Seven Who Decree Fate, and their decisions, once made, could not be unmade by any power in heaven, earth, or the underworld. These were not the oldest gods, nor necessarily the most powerful in raw terms, but they held something more important than age or strength. They held legitimacy, the right to determine how the universe would function. At the apex stood Anu, whose name meant simply sky in Sumerian, though he had become so much more than that basic element. Anu was kingship itself, the principle of divine authority from which all earthly power derived. When a Mesopotamian king claimed to rule by divine right, it was Anu's approval he invoked. Yet for all his theoretical supremacy, Anu was a distant figure, dwelling in the highest heaven, so removed from earthly concerns that humans rarely prayed to him directly. He was like the constitutional principle behind a government, essential but abstract, his power exercised through intermediaries rather than direct intervention. You are a newly crowned king of Uruk, standing in the sacred precinct at dawn on the day of your coronation, approximately 2100 BC. The ceremony has lasted all night, and your body aches from the ritual positions you have held for hours. Now, as the first light touches the top of the great ziggurat, the high priest places in your hands the symbols of divine authority, the rod and ring, the symbol, physical representations of Anu's power, transmitted through an unbroken chain from heaven to earth. You feel the weight of them, not just their physical mass, but their symbolic burden. The cool metal of the ring seems to pulse with authority, while the wooden rod, polished by centuries of handling, connects you to every king who has held it before. Around you, the smell of burning juniper fills the air, its sharp, resinous scent, meant to carry your vows upward to Anu's distant realm. The crowd below has begun to chant, a low rumble that rises and falls like distant thunder, and you understand that you are no longer merely human. You have become the intersection point between heaven and earth, bearing Anu's authority, but also his judgment should you fail. Beneath Anu in cosmic hierarchy, but often more prominent in daily worship, stood Enlil, lord of wind and storm, master of the space between heaven and earth. If Anu was divine authority in principle, Enlil was that authority in practice. His temple in Nippur was the religious center of Sumer for over 2,000 years, and his approval was necessary for any king to claim legitimate rule over more than a single city. Enlil was the god of the decree, the divine decision that once spoken could reshape reality. When he decreed that a city should fall, no walls could stand against the invaders. When he decreed prosperity, even desert land would bloom. But Enlil's power came with a terrible edge. He was the god who had decreed the Great Flood, who had decided that humanity's noise had become unbearable and that the species should be wiped clean from the earth. This was not cruelty as humans understand it, but something more frightening. Divine indifference to human survival when weighed against cosmic order. The Mesopotamians never forgot that they existed at Enlil's sufferance, that their continued survival was a privilege, not a right. The third of the great cosmic powers was Enki, whom the Babylonians called Ea, lord of the fresh waters that flowed beneath the earth. Where Enlil was stern and distant, Enki was clever and accessible. He was the god of wisdom and crafts, of magic and cunning solutions. If Enlil represented divine law, Enki represented the loopholes in that law, the clever exceptions that made survival possible. It was Enki who had warned humanity about the coming flood, who had taught them irrigation and writing, who consistently served as humanity's advocate in the divine assembly. The remaining 4 of the 7 who decree fate varied depending on the period and the city doing the counting, but usually included Shamash, the sun god, Sin, the moon god, Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, and either Marduk or Ninurta as the divine champion. Together, these 7 formed a cosmic government, meeting in assembly to decide matters too important for any single deity to determine. They were judge and jury for gods and humans alike, their verdicts final, their decisions shaping the fundamental structure of reality. The power to decree fate was not metaphorical but mechanical in Mesopotamian understanding. The gods possessed tablets of destiny, physical objects that contained the fundamental programming of the universe. To possess these tablets was to control reality itself, which is why so many myths revolve around their theft or recovery. The Epic of Anzu tells of a divine bird who steals the tablets from Enlil, temporarily throwing the universe into chaos until the hero god Ninurta recovers them. These stories reflected a deep Mesopotamian anxiety. That order was not natural but imposed, requiring constant divine maintenance to prevent a return to primordial chaos. Lords of earth and underworld. Deep beneath the earth, deeper than the roots of the oldest trees, deeper than the foundations of the mightiest ziggurats, lay a realm that every Mesopotamian knew they would one day enter, but from which none would return unchanged. The underworld, which the Sumerians called Irkalla and the Akkadians knew as Irkallatu, was not a place of punishment or reward, but something far more unsettling, a place of diminishment, where the vibrant souls of the living became shadows of their former selves, eating dust and dwelling in darkness for eternity. The approach to this realm was through 7 gates, each stripping away another aspect of earthly power and identity. The demons who guarded these passages were called the Anunnaki when they sat in judgment, the same term used for the great gods when they dwelt in heaven, suggesting that divine nature itself changed, depending on cosmic geography. The queen of this realm was Ereshkigal, whose name meant Lady of the Great Earth, a goddess so powerful that even the other gods feared to enter her domain uninvited. She had not chosen this role, but had been carried off to the underworld in the dawn of time, and her rage at this cosmic injustice pervaded her realm like a cold mist that never lifted. The air in the underworld was thick and still, heavy with the dust of ages and the weight of eternal silence. No wind stirred in those depths. No water flowed except the bitter rivers that formed its boundaries. The only sounds were the occasional moans of the dead and the rustling of their feathered garments. For the Mesopotamians imagined their souls clothed like birds, perhaps because birds could travel between earth and sky, as souls travelled between life and death. The smell was of dry earth and ancient bone, neither corrupt nor fresh but suspended in a perpetual state of desiccation. Here dwelt all who had ever lived, king and commoner alike, their earthly distinctions meaningless in the democracy of death. Ereshkigal's consort was Nergal, a god whose very name caused people to touch protective amulets and make warding gestures. Originally a god of plague and war, Nergal had forced his way into the underworld through violence and cunning, the only deity to successfully invade Death's realm and claim co-rulership. Their marriage was not one of love, but of matched power. two forces of destruction united in governing the dead. The story of their coupling was told in whispers, how Nergal had insulted Ereshkigal's messenger and been summoned to the underworld to apologize, how he had brought with him a chair that would allow him to leave, how passion had overcome them both for 6 days and nights, until Ereshkigal declared that he must remain as her husband, or she would raise the dead to outnumber the living. Between the world of light and the eternal darkness served Enki, also called Ea by the Babylonians, master of the Abzu, the freshwater ocean that existed beneath the earth but above the underworld. The Abzu was a realm of possibility, where the fundamental forces of creation still bubbled and fermented. From this aqueous realm, Enki dispensed wisdom and magic to humanity, always walking the line between order and chaos, between what was permitted and what was possible. His servants were the 7 sages, the Apkallu, fishmen who had emerged from the waters in the dawn of time to teach humanity the arts of civilization. Enki's temple in Eridu, the oldest city according to Sumerian tradition, was built over a natural spring that was believed to be a direct connection to the Abzu. Priests would lower offerings into these dark waters, watching them disappear into depths that seemed to have no bottom. The temple itself was a liminal space, neither fully in the world of the living nor the dead, where the normal rules of reality became fluid. In the inner sanctum, accessible only to the highest priests, water bubbled up through the floor in a perpetual spring, its surface sometimes calm, sometimes agitated for no earthly reason, as if reflecting storms in that otherworldly ocean below. The boundary between earth and underworld was not impermeable but required careful ritual management. At certain times of year, particularly during the month of Abu, when the heat of summer had killed all vegetation, the gates would crack open slightly, allowing the dead to smell the offerings their families left at gravesides. This was a time of great danger, when malevolent spirits might escape, when the carefully maintained order between life and death might collapse. Families would place extra offerings at crossroads, traditionally the gathering places of spirits, and would avoid speaking the names of the recently deceased, lest they draw their attention back to the world of the living. This cosmic architecture, with its careful vertical arrangement of heaven, earth, Abzu, and underworld, reflected the Mesopotamian understanding that existence was layered like their own tells, each level built upon the last, each containing its own truths and powers. The gods who ruled these realms were not distant abstractions, but immediate presences, whose influences could be felt in every spring that bubbled from the earth, every plague that swept through a city, every moment when life transformed into death. The radiant powers, light and love. Each dawn, as the first light touched the peaked top of the ziggurat of Sippar, the priests would already be awake and waiting, their faces turned eastward, ready to witness the daily miracle of Shamash's resurrection. The sun god's emergence from the gates of the eastern mountain was not merely the start of a new day, but a cosmic victory, proof that order had once again triumphed over the chaos of night. Shamash was unique among the great gods in that humans could see him directly, could feel his warmth on their skin, could watch his unwavering path across the sky. He was divine justice made visible, the all-seeing eye that witnessed every contract, every oath, every crime committed in darkness, thinking itself hidden. The Mesopotamians portrayed Shamash as a bearded figure holding a saw, not the curved blade we might imagine, but a straight-edged tool with teeth like rays of sunlight, cutting through deception and falsehood. His light was understood as both literal and metaphorical illumination. In the Code of Hammurabi, that ancient king portrayed himself receiving the law directly from Shamash, not because the sun god created these laws, but because his light revealed the eternal principles of justice that had always existed. Every court case in Mesopotamia began with an invocation to Shamash, every contract sealed with his name, for it was believed that lies would literally burn in his presence, like dry grass before flame. Yet the sun's harsh light created shadows, and the Mesopotamians understood that even divine radiance had its counterpart. As Shamash descended each evening through the western gates, he entered the underworld, becoming judge of the dead during the night hours, ensuring that even in that realm of diminishment, some form of justice prevailed. This dual role made him the only deity equally at home in the brightest and darkest places of the cosmos, a bridge between opposing realms. If Shamash represented the predictable, the lawful, the rationally comprehensible aspect of divine power, his counterpart Ishtar embodied everything that defied categorization. She was simultaneously the goddess of love and war, of prostitutes and marriage, of gentle rain and devastating storms. The Babylonians called her Ishtar, the Sumerians Inanna, but by any name she was contradiction incarnate, the divine feminine principle that refused all attempts at limitation or definition. Her planet was Venus, both morning and evening star, and like that celestial body, she appeared in different aspects while remaining fundamentally herself. The evening air in her temple at Uruk was thick with incense, a mixture of myrrh and cedar smoke that clung to clothing and hair, marking all who entered as having been in the presence of the goddess. The temple courtyard would fill with supplicants as diverse as Ishtar herself, warriors seeking courage before battle, young lovers wanting their affections returned, merchants praying for successful ventures, and her sacred servants, the temple prostitutes, whose coupling with worshippers was understood as a form of prayer made flesh. The sounds that emerged from the temple complex at night ranged from ecstatic cries to mournful lamentations, for Ishtar governed all passionate extremes. Her mythology was equally extreme. The stories tell of her demanding the bull of heaven from Anu to destroy Gilgamesh for refusing her advances, of her descending to the underworld and being struck dead, only to be resurrected 3 days later, of her stealing the divine powers from Enki through a drinking contest and refusing to return them. She was the only deity who could threaten to break down the gates of the underworld and raise the dead to devour the living and be taken seriously in that threat. Warriors wore her 8-pointed star symbol into battle, not for protection, but for fury, understanding that Ishtar's blessing meant victory, but also blood madness, glory but also potential destruction. Between these extremes of rational light and passionate chaos moved Sin, the moon god, whose name the Sumerians rendered as Nana. His was the light that did not burn, the illumination that allowed for rest, the calendar keeper whose phases ordered time into comprehensible months. Where Shamash's movement was daily and predictable, Sin's monthly journey through phases of increase and decrease gave humans their first understanding of cyclical time beyond the simple alternation of day and night. The Mesopotamian month began with the first visible crescent, that delicate silver arc that appeared just after sunset, growing night by night until the full moon dominated the sky, then diminishing until it disappeared entirely, only to be reborn. Sin's great temple at housed astronomer priests who tracked not just the moon's phases, but its subtle variations in timing and position, creating lunar calendars so accurate that they could predict eclipses. These priests understood that time itself was a divine gift, that without the moon's regular phases, humans would have no way to coordinate activities beyond the simple count of days. The agricultural year, the religious festivals, the payment of debts, all depended on Sin's reliable journey through the night sky. Together, these radiant powers formed a divine triad that governed the visible cosmos. Shamash ruled the day with impartial justice, Ishtar brought passion and conflict that made life worth living, and Sin marked the passage of time that gave mortal existence its poignant urgency. They were the gods humans could see, could track, could rely upon to maintain their celestial duties. Yet their very visibility made them paradoxically more mysterious. For how could something so clearly divine, so obviously beyond human reach, also be so present, so intimately involved in daily life? This paradox lay at the heart of Mesopotamian religion, the understanding that the gods were simultaneously transcendent and immanent, unreachably distant and intimately present. Storm and war, the younger powers. The old gods had established order, divided the cosmos into neat realms, assigned every force its proper place and function. But order, the Mesopotamians understood, was not the natural state of the universe. It required enforcement, protection, and sometimes violent restoration. For this work, a new generation of divine warriors arose, gods born not from primordial waters, but from conscious divine will, created or elevated specifically to face threats that the older, more stately deities could not or would not confront directly. Foremost among these champions stood Marduk, whose rise from the patron deity of a minor city to the supreme god of the Babylonian pantheon mirrors the political ascent of Babylon itself. But Marduk's elevation was not merely political propaganda dressed in theological clothing. His story, preserved in the Enuma Elish, addressed a fundamental problem in Mesopotamian theology. If the old gods were so powerful, why did chaos still threaten? Why did cities fall? Why did floods destroy? Why did order require such constant maintenance? The answer was that the universe needed a new kind of divine power, one that could match primordial chaos with equal violence. When Tiamat, the primordial saltwater, raised an army of monsters to destroy the younger gods, the divine assembly discovered that traditional authority meant nothing against raw, primitive rage. Anu's legitimate kingship could not stop her. Enlil's decrees held no power over one who predated the very concept of law. The gods cowered in their shrines, paralyzed by the realization that the foundational powers of the universe had turned against them. It was then that Marduk stepped forward, but his price for championship was steep: absolute authority over all gods and the power to decree fate without consultation. The desperate gods agreed, and in that moment, the cosmos shifted from gerontocracy to meritocracy, from rule by age to rule by capability. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat was not fought with swords and spears, but with the fundamental forces of nature. Marduk wielded the four winds, the seven storms, and something the texts call the evil wind, a force so terrible that even its description was considered dangerous. When he finally faced Tiamat, he did not simply defeat her, he literally unmade her, splitting her body like a shellfish, using one half to create the sky and the other to form the earth. This was divine violence on a cosmic scale, not destruction for its own sake, but the violent imposition of order upon chaos, the forced transformation of the primordial into the structured. Yet Marduk was a latecomer to divine warfare. Long before Babylon rose to prominence, the Sumerians had their own divine champion in Ninurta, son of Enlil, whose exploits against the forces of chaos were already ancient when Marduk's priests were first learning to write. Ninurta was the god of war as agricultural necessity, the divine force that cleared the land of monsters so that humans could plant and harvest. His great enemy was the Asarg, a diseased demon so hideous that fish boiled alive in rivers it passed, and whose offspring with the mountains were the stone demons that made certain lands uninhabitable. The epic Lugal-A describes Ninurta's victory over the Asarg in terms that combine military prowess with landscape engineering. After defeating the demon, Ninurta piled up the stones of its army to create the first dam, channeling the previously chaotic waters into irrigation channels. This was the Mesopotamian ideal of warfare, not destruction for glory, but violence in service of civilization. Every spring, when the mountain snows melted and threatened to flood the lowlands, priests would recite this epic, calling upon Ninurta to once again contain the waters, to maintain his ancient victory over chaos. You stand in the arsenal of Nineveh. The year is 670 BC, and the air tastes of metal and leather, oil and fear. Tomorrow, the Assyrian army marches against Elam, and tonight the weapons are being blessed. The priests of Ninurta move between the stacked spears and piled shields, sprinkling them with water from the Tigris, mixed with crushed juniper berries. Each weapon must be dedicated to the god of justified war, transformed from mere bronze and iron into instruments of divine will. The soldiers stand in perfect silence, their faces painted with the sacred designs that mark them as Ninurta's earthly avatars. You can smell the sweat beneath their armor, the cedar oil they've rubbed into their leather straps, the sharp scent of wine on the breath of those who've already begun the ritual drinking that will continue until dawn. As the high priest raises the standard of Ninurta, a strange calm settles over the assembled warriors. They are no longer merely human soldiers, but participants in the eternal cosmic battle between order and chaos, their individual deaths or survivals subsumed into a greater divine narrative. The storm god Adad occupied a unique position among these warrior deities, for his violence could either destroy or nurture, and humans could never be certain which aspect would manifest. His weapon was not a sword or spear, but the storm itself, particularly the sudden, violent thunderstorms that could transform the Mesopotamian landscape in minutes. When Adad was benevolent, his rains filled the irrigation channels and made the barley grow tall. When he was wrathful, his floods could erase entire cities, leaving nothing but mud and memory. The unpredictability of Adad reflected a deep Mesopotamian anxiety about divine violence. Unlike Marduk's cosmic battle or Ninurta's monster slaying, which were singular events or responses to specific threats, Adad's violence was seasonal, regular, and unavoidable. Every year, the storm season would come, and every year, humans would wonder whether this would be a year of blessing or catastrophe. The rituals surrounding Adad were thus particularly elaborate and anxious, full of divination attempts to determine his mood and repeated offerings to maintain his favour. These younger warrior gods represented a theological evolution, an acknowledgement that the universe required active maintenance, that chaos was not a one-time enemy defeated in the beginning, but a constant threat requiring eternal vigilance. They were the gods of necessary violence, of the sword that protected the plough, of the flood that both destroyed and fertilized. In them, the Mesopotamians recognized a truth that would echo through all subsequent mythology, that creation and destruction were not opposites but partners in the eternal dance of existence. Part 4. Major Myths and Stories. The War in Heaven, Enuma Elish. The universe was young, and already it was failing. In the divine halls where the first gods gathered, a terrible silence had fallen, the kind that precedes either surrender or desperate action. Word had spread through every shrine and temple in the heavenly realm. Tiamat, the primordial mother, she who had given birth to them all, had declared war on her children. Not the petty conflicts that occasionally erupted between rival deities, not the temporary tantrums that could be resolved with offerings and apologies, but total war, existential war, the kind that would end with either a new cosmic order or a return to the primordial silence that Apsu had craved before his murder. The catalyst had been blood, as it so often was in divine affairs. The younger gods, finding Apsu's constant complaints about their noise intolerable, had murdered him while he slept, turning his body into the foundations of the earth. Enki, clever Enki, had built his temple over Apsu's corpse, a act of such breathtaking audacity that even the other gods had been stunned into momentary silence. But Tiamat's silence was different. It was the silence of grief, transforming into rage, of a mother's love curdling into the desire for absolute vengeance. When she finally spoke, it was to pronounce a curse that made the foundations of heaven tremble. She would create new children, monsters immune to the weapons and magic of the gods, and with them she would erase every trace of her treacherous offspring from existence. The monsters Tiamat created were not mere beasts, but violations of nature itself, beings that could not exist under the normal laws of reality. The texts describe them in language that struggles against its own limitations. Serpents whose venom was so potent it poisoned the air around them, making it impossible for gods to approach. The Mushusu, dragons with the front legs of lions, the rear legs of eagles, and necks that could stretch across the entire vault of heaven. The Ugalu, demons of drought, whose very presence desiccated everything, turning rivers to dust and gods to brittle husks. Most terrifying of all were the 11 mighty champions she created, specifically to lead her army, beings whose names were curses, whose existence was antithetical to ordered creation. At the head of this nightmare army, Tiamat placed Chingu, her new consort, and around his neck she hung the tablets of destiny, the cosmic administrative documents that controlled the fundamental operations of the universe. With these tablets, Chingu's every word became reality. If he decreed that fire should freeze or water should burn, it would be so. The gods watched in horror as the basic laws they had taken for granted began to flux and bend under Chingu's experimental commands. Mountains flowed like water, stars fell from their fixed positions, and the boundaries between the cosmic realms began to dissolve. The divine assembly convened in panic. Anu, the Sky Father, king of the gods, approached Tiamat with words of reconciliation, but she drove him back with a roar that shattered the gates of heaven. Enlil, lord of the decree, attempted to bind her with words of power, but his decrees dissolved before reaching her, like scrolls thrown into a fire. The gods retreated to their innermost shrines, some weeping, others sitting in stunned silence, all aware that they faced not just defeat, but complete annihilation. It was then that Marduk, young Marduk of Babylon, whose name meant bull calf of the sun, stepped forward with an offer and a demand. The negotiation that followed would reshape the entire structure of divine authority. Marduk would face Tiamat, but only if the gods granted him supreme authority, not temporarily, but permanently. He demanded the power to decree fate, without consultation, to promote and demote deities at will, to reorganize the cosmos according to his vision. The desperate gods agreed, and to prove his worthiness, Marduk performed a demonstration. He spoke a garment into existence, then spoke it into non-existence, then spoke it back into being. This was not illusion, but actual creation and destruction through pure divine will, a power that previously only the primordial forces had possessed. Armed with the combined weapons of all the gods, including Enlil's 7 winds and Anu's net of heaven, Marduk rode out to battle on his storm chariot, pulled by 4 creatures whose names translated as Killer, Pitiless, Trampler, and Swift. The battlefield was the space between spaces, the void that existed between the ordered cosmos and the primordial chaos. Here, normal physics meant nothing. Up and down were suggestions, time flowed backward and forward simultaneously, and the only constant was the will of the combatants. You are present at this cosmic battle, not as a participant, but as an impossible witness, standing on nothing, breathing vacuum, watching gods war with forces that predate physics itself. The sound is beyond sound, a vibration that bypasses your ears and resonates directly in your bones. You see Marduk release the evil wind, and it is not air moving but the concept of dissolution itself, unmaking Tiamat's monsters at a conceptual level, erasing not just their bodies, but the very possibility of their existence. Tiamat opens her mouth to swallow Marduk whole, her jaws expanding beyond any physical dimension, becoming a portal to the uncreation that existed before the cosmos. But Marduk drives the winds into her mouth, inflating her like a grotesque balloon, her primordial body stretched beyond even her infinite capacity. The smell of ozone and something older fills your nostrils, the scent of reality itself burning, of physics breaking down at the quantum level. When Marduk's arrow pierces Tiamat's heart, the universe stops. Not slows, not pauses, but stops, as the fundamental force that had existed since before existence itself finally dies. Then, in the silence that follows, Marduk begins his great work. He splits Tiamat's corpse with the precision of a butcher and the vision of an architect. Her upper half becomes the sky, her lower half the earth. Her eyes become the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates, her breath the winds, her spittle the rain and fog. This is not mere symbolism, but divine recycling, the transformation of chaos into the raw materials of ordered creation. But Marduk's greatest innovation was yet to come. From Chingu's blood, mixed with clay and divine spittle, he created humanity, not as toys or pets, but as servants whose specific purpose was to perform the labour that the gods found tedious, to maintain the temples, perform the offerings, and through their worship, provide the gods with the sustenance of prayer and sacrifice. Humanity was thus born from the blood of a failed usurper, carrying within them both divine essence and the seed of rebellion, forever caught between order and chaos, servitude and the desire for freedom. The Enuma Elish ends with the gods proclaiming Marduk's 50 names, each one a different aspect of his power, a different administrative function he had absorbed from the older gods. This was not just praise, but a transfer of authority, a cosmic reorganization chart with Marduk as CEO of reality. The old consensual assembly of gods was replaced by a divine monarchy, efficient but autocratic, orderly but inflexible. The universe was saved, but at the cost of its primordial democracy. Order had won, but the price was freedom, even for the gods themselves. The descent, when heaven visited hell. The goddess Inanna stood at the edge of the great above, her jewelry catching the last light of the world she knew, each piece a constellation of power that marked her as queen of heaven and earth. Before her yawned the entrance to the underworld, a crack in reality that exhaled the cold breath of eternity, carrying with it the scent of dust that had never known moisture and silence that had never known song. She had dressed for this moment with the deliberation of a warrior preparing for battle, each garment and ornament, chosen not for beauty, but for the protection it might offer, in the realm where her sister Ereshkigal ruled with absolute authority over the dead. The reasons for her descent varied depending on which priest you asked, which tablet you read, which city's version of the myth you heard. Some said she went to attend the funeral of Gugalanna, the bull of heaven, who was Ereshkigal's husband. Others whispered that Inanna sought to extend her dominion, to add the underworld to her collection of conquered realms. But perhaps the truest reason was the simplest. She went because she could not bear that there existed a realm beyond her influence, a place where her beauty held no power, where her passionate nature met only the indifference of death. She adorned herself with the 7 divine powers, the manifestations of civilized existence that she wore like armor. The Shugura, the crown of the steppe, rested on her head, marking her as sovereign of the wild places. Lapis lazuli beads hung around her neck, each one containing a different aspect of divine authority. Her breastplate was hammered from meteoric iron, metal that had never touched earthly flame. She wrapped herself in the royal robe that changed colour depending on the viewer's heart, appearing as their deepest desire. The mascara around her eyes was mixed with the dust of fallen stars, allowing her to see through illusion and deception. In her hand she carried the rod and line, the measuring tools of divine justice, though she wielded them more often as weapons than as instruments of fairness. At the first gate, the gatekeeper Neti stopped her with a question that echoed through the tunnels of the dead. Why has your heart led you to the road from which no traveller returns? Inanna's answer was smooth as oil, false as fool's gold. She claimed to come for the funeral rites, but Neti, ancient beyond mortal comprehension, heard the lie beneath her words. He left her standing in the darkness that seemed to press against her skin like wet cloth, and descended to the 7th level to inform Ereshkigal of her sister's arrival. Ereshkigal's response was a laugh that started as bitter and ended as a howl of rage. She knew her sister, knew the hunger that drove Inanna to collect powers and positions like a mortal might collect jewels. But Ereshkigal also knew the laws of her realm, older than the gods themselves, inviolate as gravity. Anyone who entered the underworld must do so on the underworld's terms. She instructed Neti on the ancient protocol, the stripping away that every soul, divine or mortal, must undergo to enter the land of no return. At each of the 7 gates, Neti demanded one of Inanna's divine garments, one of her protective powers. At the first gate, her crown was removed, and she felt sovereignty slip from her like water from cupped hands. At the second, the lapis beads were taken, and with them went her ability to command respect. By the third gate, as her breastplate was stripped away, she began to understand the trap she had entered, but pride and curiosity drove her forward. The 4th gate took her robe, leaving her power to inspire, desire pooling at her feet like discarded silk. At the 5th, her mascara was wiped away, and the underworld revealed itself in its true horror, a vast grey expanse, where shadows had more substance than the spirits who cast them. The 6th gate demanded her rod and line, her last weapons, her final claim to authority, and at the 7th and final gate, even her basic garment was stripped away, leaving her naked as the dead themselves, approaching her sister's throne with nothing but her divine essence, which in this realm meant less than nothing. She entered Ereshkigal's throne room, not as the Queen of Heaven, but as another spirit seeking audience with death itself. You are standing in that throne room, though standing is not quite accurate in a place where direction is memory and substance is negotiable. The air, if it can be called air, is thick as water, but provides no sustenance, filling your lungs with the taste of millennia-old dust. Ereshkigal sits on a throne, carved from a single piece of crystallized shadow, her beauty terrible, not in its absence but in its perfection, like a statue carved from ice that burns to touch. Around her stand the 7 judges of the underworld, the Anunnaki in their chthonic aspect, their faces hidden beneath cowls that seem to absorb light rather than merely block it. The walls pulse with a barely perceptible rhythm, and you realize they are built from the compressed souls of the forgotten dead, those whose names have been erased from human memory. The silence is so complete that you can hear your own thoughts echo, bouncing off the boundaries of death itself. Ereshkigal spoke one word, a word that contained within it the entire concept of judgment, and the 7 judges turned their eyes upon Inanna. Those eyes did not see flesh or beauty or divinity, but the truth of existence, the fundamental equation of life and death that must always balance. They spoke in unison, their verdict not a decision, but a recognition of cosmic law. Guilty. The word hit Inanna like a physical blow, driving her to her knees, then prone, then beyond prone into a state of existence that had no physical analogue. Ereshkigal's gaze fell upon her sister, and it was the gaze of entropy itself, the look that transforms order into chaos, life into death, something into nothing. Inanna died. Not the poetic death of mortals, with last words and gradual fading, but divine death, instant and absolute. Her corpse was hung on a meat hook, not out of cruelty, but because that was simply where dead things were stored in the underworld, like tools in a shed or grain in a storehouse. For 3 days and 3 nights, she hung there, her divine flesh beginning the slow transformation into underworld substance, her essence seeping into the grey stones, feeding the realm of death with the power of life. Above, in the world of the living, Inanna's absence created a crisis that threatened existence itself. Without the goddess of love, animals stopped mating, crops stopped growing, and humans lost all passion, becoming automata, going through the motions of life without any driving force. The gods realized that Inanna's desire, however troublesome, was essential to creation's continuation. Enki, ever clever, created 2 beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, creatures so small and insignificant that they could slip through the gates of death without triggering the ancient protocols. He gave them the food and water of life and sent them to bargain for Inanna's return. The negotiation that followed established the fundamental rule that would govern death for all time. No one leaves the underworld without providing a replacement. Inanna could return, but someone must take her place on the meat hook, she agreed. And as she ascended through the 7 gates, her garments and powers were restored, each one feeling heavier than before, weighted with the knowledge of what lay beneath all power and beauty. But when she reached the world above, she found it full of mourners, all except her husband Dumuzi, who sat on her throne, dressed in her robes, apparently untroubled by her absence. In that moment of betrayal and rage, she spoke the decree that would echo through all mythology. Dumuzi would be her replacement, spending half the year in the underworld while she ruled above, then switching places in an eternal cycle that explained the seasons themselves. The deluge, when gods regretted creation. The noise had become unbearable, not the sharp crash of thunder or the piercing shriek of wind, but something worse, the constant, grinding sound of humanity multiplying, building, arguing, celebrating, mourning, living. 600 years had passed since Marduk created humans from Chingu's blood, and in that time they had spread across the earth like oil on water, their cities rising from the plains, their voices joining in a cacophony that rose day and night to the heavens. The gods could find no rest, no silence, no peace in their celestial dwellings. Enlil, lord of wind and divine decree, pressed his hands against his ears, but the sound penetrated even divine flesh, the endless chatter of 600,000 human voices living their brief, noisy lives. The divine assembly convened not in their usual splendor, but in exhausted irritation, like neighbors meeting to discuss a household that plays music too loud at all hours. Various solutions were proposed and implemented. First, Enlil sent disease, hoping to thin the human population to manageable numbers. The plague swept through the cities, turning the streets into charnel houses, but humans bred faster than they died, and within a generation their numbers had recovered. Next came drought, the gods withholding rain until the fields cracked like broken pottery, and the rivers ran low as trickles. Humans adapted, digging deeper wells, storing grain, learning to survive on less. Then came famine, years of failed harvests that should have broken them. But humans proved resourceful, eating things the gods had never imagined were edible, somehow surviving where divine logic said they should perish. Finally, Enlil's patience shattered like a clay tablet dropped on stone. He stood in the divine assembly and spoke the words that would nearly end the world. Let there be a flood to destroy mankind, utterly and completely. Let the waters above and below converge. Let no seed survive, no child escape, no memory remain. Let us return the earth to the silence of the primordial waters. The decree was absolute, binding on all gods, sealed with the 7 divine seals that could not be broken. Any deity who warned humanity would face punishment worse than death. Existence in the void between being and unbeing. But Enki, lord of wisdom and friend to humanity, found himself torn between cosmic law and compassion. The solution he devised was worthy of his reputation for cunning. In the city of Shurapak, there lived a man named Utnapishtim, whose name meant he who saw life, a priest of Enki known for his wisdom and discretion. Enki did not speak to Utnapishtim directly, which would have violated Enlil's decree. Instead, he spoke to the reed wall of Utnapishtim's house, knowing the priest was on the other side, listening. Reed wall, Enki intoned, hear my words and remember. Tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon wealth and seek survival. Abandon possessions and preserve life. Bring into the boat the seed of all living things. The instructions were precise, mathematical in their specificity. The boat was to be a perfect cube, as high as it was, wide as it was long, 120 cubits in each dimension, 7 decks divided into 9 sections each, creating 63 compartments. The wood was to be sealed with bitumen inside and out, layer upon layer, until it gleamed black as obsidian. The precision was necessary because this was not merely a boat, but an artificial cosmic egg, a miniature universe that would preserve life through the return to primordial chaos. Utnapishtim told his neighbours he was building the boat because he feared Enlil's wrath and was fleeing to live with Enki in the Abzu. They laughed at him, this old fool building a mountain of wood and tar on dry land, but they helped him anyway, drawn by wages and wine and the spectacle of such magnificent folly. On the 7th day, the boat was complete, and Utnapishtim began loading it with everything. Enki's cryptic message had suggested gold and silver. Yes, but more importantly, the seed of every plant, pairs of every animal, and craftsmen with their families, those who carried the knowledge of civilization in their hands and minds. The morning the flood began was beautiful, the kind of clear dawn that made the world seem newly created. Then, on the horizon, a black cloud appeared, and within it was Adad, the storm god, his voice the thunder that announced the end. The Anunnaki lifted their torches, setting the heavens ablaze with unholy light. Enlil opened the gates of the celestial reservoirs, and water began to fall, not as rain but as solid sheets, as if the sky itself was liquefying. From below, Enki, with tears streaming down his face, opened the springs of the Abzu, and water erupted from every well, every spring, every crack in the earth. The gods themselves were terrified by what they had unleashed. This was not controlled destruction, but chaos returning. The careful barriers between cosmic realms dissolving. They fled to the highest heaven, cowering against the crystalline walls like dogs in a storm. Ishtar wept for the humans she had helped create, her lamentation piercing even the sound of cosmic destruction. How could I speak evil in the divine assembly? How could I decree war for the destruction of my people? I gave birth to my people, and now like fish they fill the sea. For 6 days and 7 nights, the storm raged. Mountains dissolved like salt in water. Cities vanished without trace. The very geography of the world was erased and rewritten. Inside the boat, Utnapishtim and his passengers huddled in absolute darkness, the sounds outside beyond description, not just wind and water, but the death screams of a world, the crack of cosmic foundations breaking, the hiss of stars being extinguished as the flood reached even into the lower heavens. The smell inside the boat was overwhelming, every animal scent magnified in the confined space, mixed with the acid smell of fear and the copper taste of divine terror that permeated even these protected walls. On the 7th day, the storm ended as suddenly as it had begun. Utnapishtim opened a window, and light entered, revealing a world transformed into an endless ocean, smooth as polished metal, reflecting a sun that seemed uncertain whether it should still shine. He released a dove, but it returned, finding no place to land. He released a swallow, and it too returned. Finally he released a raven, and it did not return, finding carrion to feast upon as the waters receded. The boat came to rest on Mount Nimush, and Utnapishtim made offerings to the gods, who gathered around the sweet smoke like flies, starved for the sustenance of sacrifice after 7 days without human worship. When Enlil discovered that humans had survived, his rage was terrible, but the other gods stood against him. The flood had shown them that without humans, they themselves diminished, their glory meaningless without worshippers to perceive it. A new covenant was established. Never again would the gods attempt to destroy humanity wholesale. Instead, they would limit human life to 120 years, introduce infertility and infant mortality to control population, and create the demon Lamashtu to ensure that human numbers never again grew beyond divine tolerance. Utnapishtim and his wife were granted immortality and sent to live at the mouth of the rivers, at the edge of the world, the eternal witnesses to both divine mercy and divine wrath. The plant of immortality, Gilgamesh among the gods. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, sat beside the dying body of Enkidu, his companion whose friendship had meant more than all his royal glory. For 6 days and 7 nights, he refused to accept the truth before him until a maggot fell from Enkidu's nostril, and the king finally understood that death was not sleep, but transformation into something utterly other. The grief that seized him was not the dignified sorrow of a king, but the raw, animal howl of loss that strips away all pretense of civilization. He tore his royal robes, pulled out his carefully braided hair, and fled Uruk like a madman, wearing only the skin of a lion, seeking the one mortal who had escaped death's dominion. The journey to find Utnapishtim, survivor of the flood, led Gilgamesh to the edges of the world itself, where the mountains that held up the sky met the waters at the world's end. Here stood the Scorpion people, guardians of the sun's path, whose gaze meant death to any mortal who met their eyes. Their bodies were horror-perfected, human to the waist, but below, the segmented form of scorpions the size of houses, their stingers dripping venom that could poison rivers. Yet when they saw Gilgamesh, they recognized the divine portion of his nature, glowing like banked coals beneath his mortal flesh, and they allowed him passage into the tunnel through which Shamash travelled each night. For 12 double hours, Gilgamesh ran through absolute darkness, a blackness so complete it had weight and substance, pressing against him like water. No sound existed here except his own footsteps and laboured breathing, no sensation except the stone beneath his feet, and the terrible certainty that if he stopped, if he gave in to the terror clawing at his mind, he would be trapped forever in this space between day and night. When he finally emerged, gasping, into the garden of the gods, the beauty nearly killed him in an entirely different way. Here grew trees with leaves of lapis lazuli and fruits of carnelian, their branches singing in harmonies that human ears were never meant to hear. The ground was carpeted with flowers that bloomed eternally, their perfume containing memories of every spring that had ever been. Beyond the garden lay the waters of death, and beside them sat Siduri, the divine barmaid, in her tavern at the world's edge. She saw Gilgamesh approaching, this wild figure in lion skin, with the eyes of someone who had looked too deeply into the abyss, and she barred her door. But Gilgamesh convinced her of his identity and his quest, and she gave him advice that he did not want to hear. Gilgamesh, where are you wandering? The life that you seek you will never find. When the gods created mankind, they assigned death to humanity, but life they kept for themselves. Fill your belly, Gilgamesh. Day and night make merry. Let your days be full of joy. Love the child who holds your hand. Let your wife delight in your embrace. These things alone are the portion of humanity. But Gilgamesh would not be deterred. Siduri, seeing his determination, directed him to Urshanabi, ferryman of the waters of death, whose boat was the only vessel that could cross those lethal waters, where a single drop meant instant death to any mortal. The crossing required special preparations. Gilgamesh had to cut exactly 300 punting poles, each one to be used once and discarded, for anything that touched the waters of death became itself an agent of mortality. As they crossed, Gilgamesh could see beneath the surface the shadows of everything that had ever died, not just humans but animals, plants, even ideas and dreams, all slowly dissolving in those corrosive waters. Finally, on the far shore where the world ended and the eternal began, Gilgamesh found Utnapishtim, the far distant, the one who had transcended death. But instead of a godlike figure, radiating power, he found an old man sitting quietly, looking exactly like any grandfather, enjoying retirement. The conversation that followed was perhaps the cruelest lesson in all mythology. Utnapishtim told Gilgamesh the story of the flood, but the message was clear. His immortality was not earned but given, not achievable but granted by divine whim that would never be repeated. The gods had made their exception and would make no other. To prove that Gilgamesh lacked even the basic prerequisites for immortality, Utnapishtim challenged him to stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. If he could not master sleep, the little death, how could he hope to master death itself? Gilgamesh, exhausted from his journey, fell asleep almost immediately. Utnapishtim's wife baked a loaf of bread each day he slept, and when Gilgamesh woke on the 7th day, convinced he had only dozed for a moment, the 7 loaves in various stages of decay proved his failure. He had not conquered sleep. He had been conquered by it. You are there in that moment of ultimate despair, standing on that impossible shore where the primordial waters meet the edge of existence. The air tastes of salt and eternity, thick with the weight of endless time. Gilgamesh kneels on the beach, his fingers digging into sand that has never known the cycle of tides, only the eternal presence of the same waves, repeating their ancient rhythm. His body shakes with sobs that seem to come from somewhere deeper than his chest, from the mortal third of his nature that knows, truly knows, that it will end. The sun here does not set, but simply exists, casting shadows that never move, and in that terrible eternal light, Gilgamesh finally understands that he has been seeking not immortality, but the ability to deny truth, to refuse the fundamental equation of existence, that all things that begin must end. Utnapishtim's wife, moved by pity for this broken king, convinced her husband to give Gilgamesh a consolation prize, a secret that even most gods did not know. Deep beneath the waters of death grew a plant called the old man becomes young again, a thorny growth that could restore youth, if not grant immortality. Gilgamesh dove deep, deeper than any mortal had ever gone, his lungs burning, his eyes blinded by the pressure, until his hands found the plant. The thorns pierced his palms, his blood mixing with the waters of death, but he held on and returned to the surface with his prize. The journey home was filled with hope. For the first time since Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh planned to test the plant on an old man in Uruk, and if it worked, he would share it with all his people, creating a city of the eternally young, if not immortal. But on the way, stopping at a pool to bathe, he left the plant on the shore. A serpent, smelling its sweet fragrance, stole it and ate it, immediately shedding its skin and emerging renewed. Gilgamesh watched the snake disappear into the reeds, carrying with it humanity's last chance at conquering age, and he laughed, a bitter sound that contained within it the acceptance of every future death, including his own. He returned to Uruk, empty-handed, but not empty. Standing before his city's great walls, he spoke to Urshanabi, the ferryman, but really to himself and to all future generations. See the walls of Uruk, how they gleam like burnished bronze in the sunday. Examine the foundation, inspect the brickwork. Is it not burnt brick? And did not the 7 sages lay its foundation? 1/3 of the city is city, 1/3 is garden, 1/3 is field, with the precinct of the goddess Ishtar. These are the dimensions of Uruk. This was immortality, not of the flesh but of deed, not of the individual but of civilization itself. Gilgamesh had sought to escape death, and found instead the reason to accept it, that mortality gives weight to action, urgency to love, meaning to the brief moment between birth and grave. Part 5. Rituals, Practices, and Cultural Impact. Sacred marriage, when gods walked on earth. Each spring, as the first barley shoots pushed through the dark soil of Mesopotamia, the cities prepared for the most ancient and essential of all rituals, the sacred marriage that would ensure another year of fertility and abundance. This was not mere ceremony or symbolic theatre, but a cosmic necessity, an annual renewal of the contract between heaven and earth, between the divine powers of generation and the human need for survival. The ritual had many names across the centuries and cities. The Sumerians called it the Hieros Gamos. The Babylonians knew it as the marriage of Marduk and Sarpanit, but always at its heart lay the same mystery, the transformation of human actors into divine vessels. In the city of Uruk, where Inanna's great temple dominated the skyline, the ritual reached its most elaborate form. For weeks before the appointed night, the chosen priestess would undergo purification, her body washed in water, mixed with crushed flowers, her food limited to offerings that had first been presented to the goddess. She would sleep in the temple's inner sanctum, allowing Inanna's essence to gradually suffuse her being until the boundary between priestess and goddess became permeable as morning mist. The king, meanwhile, prepared through different trials, demonstrating his strength through ritual combat, his wisdom through the correct recitation of cosmic genealogies, his worthiness through gifts to the temple that would impoverish smaller kingdoms. On the night of the new moon, closest to the spring equinox, the transformation would begin. The priestess, now dressed in Inanna's traditional garments, including the hip ornaments that clattered like rain on leaves when she walked, would be carried on a palanquin through the streets. The citizens would line the processional way, throwing flower petals and barley grains, their voices raised in hymns that had been sung since before writing existed. The air would be thick with incense, so much that the stars seemed to shimmer through a veil of sacred smoke, and the sound of drums would pulse like a gigantic heartbeat, coordinating the movements of thousands of participants into a single organism of worship. You are a young temple initiate, selected to hold one of the sacred torches that light the goddess's way to the marriage chamber. The year is 2100 BC, and King Shulgi himself will play the role of Dumuzi tonight. Your hands tremble slightly as you grip the cedar wood handle of your torch, its flame fed by oil, pressed from sesame seeds grown in temple fields. The heat from the fire mixes with the warmth of bodies pressed close in the narrow street, and you can smell the mingled scents of sweat, perfumed oil, and the crushed herbs strewn on the ground. As the goddess passes, carried high above the crowd, you catch a glimpse of her face through the sheer veils, and for a moment you cannot say whether you see the priestess you have known since childhood or the goddess herself. Her eyes, rimmed with kohl made from ground antimony, seem to contain depths that have existed since before the world's foundation. The crowd surges forward, everyone wanting to be touched by even the shadow of divinity, and you struggle to keep your torch steady, knowing that if its flame dies, it will be taken as an omen that the goddess rejects this year's union. The marriage chamber was not in the temple proper, but in a special structure built anew each year, from reeds and hung with tapestries, depicting the cosmic marriages of the past. Inside, a bed was prepared with sheets of linen so fine they seemed woven from moonlight, and the air was perfumed with myrrh and frankincense. What happened within that chamber was both intensely physical and transcendently spiritual. The ancient texts are explicit about the sexual nature of the union, with hymns describing in detail the goddess's pleasure, the king's vigour, the moment of climax when heaven and earth merged in ecstatic unity. But this was not human sexuality, as commonly understood. This was cosmic procreation, the actual mechanism by which the universe renewed its fertility. The hymns sung during the ritual, preserved on tablets that scribes copied with trembling hands, and reveal the theological complexity of the act. The priestess would speak as Inanna, my honeyman sweetens me always. My lord, the honeyman of the gods, he is the one my womb loves best. The king would respond as Dumuzi, O lady, your breast is your field, Inanna, your breast is your field, your broad field that pours out grain. These were not metaphors but magical formulae, words that when spoken by the correct persons at the correct time, actually transformed flesh into cosmic principle, bed into primordial mound, sexual union into the generative force that kept the universe from sliding back into sterile chaos. The morning after the sacred marriage, the entire city would wait in tense anticipation for the goddess's pronouncement. If the union had been successful, if the cosmic forces had properly aligned, the priestess, still speaking as Inanna, would declare the coming year's fate: abundant harvests, successful military campaigns, healthy children. But if something had gone wrong, if the king had proved unworthy, or the ritual had been improperly performed, the goddess might pronounce doom. Cities had fallen, dynasties had ended, based on what transpired in that reed chamber during the sacred night. Beyond the royal sacred marriage, the temples maintained a constant practice of sacred prostitution, though that term carries modern connotations that obscure the Mesopotamian understanding. The women and men who served in this capacity were not degraded but honoured, their sexuality a form of prayer, their bodies temples within the temple. Merchants would visit them before embarking on trading journeys, soldiers before battle, farmers before planting. Each sexual act a smaller echo of the great sacred marriage, each orgasm a moment when mortal flesh touched divine ecstasy. The children born from these unions were considered blessed, often raised in the temple to become priests and priestesses themselves, living bridges between the sacred and profane. Ziggurats, ladders to the divine realm. Rising from the flat alluvial plains like mountains born from human will, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia were more than architectural achievements. They were cosmic anchors, holding heaven and earth in their proper relationship. Each one was built according to plans that were themselves considered sacred, revealed to ancient kings in dreams or delivered by the god's own messengers. The proportions were not arbitrary, but reflected the mathematical structure of the universe itself, each level corresponding to a different heavenly sphere, each brick placed according to cosmic necessity. The great ziggurat of Babylon, the Enki, which meant house of the foundation of heaven and earth, rose nearly 300 feet into the sky, its 7 levels painted in colours that corresponded to the 7 visible planetary bodies. The lowest level was black as pitch, representing Saturn and the underworld foundations. Above it rose levels of white for Jupiter, purple for Mercury, blue for Venus, vermilion for Mars, silver for the moon, and at the apex, gold for the sun and the dwelling place of Marduk himself. To climb this ziggurat was not merely to ascend a building, but to journey through the cosmos, each level requiring its own purification rituals, its own passwords, its own state of consciousness. The construction of a ziggurat was itself a religious act that could take generations to complete. Every brick was formed from mud, taken from sacred spots, mixed with water blessed by priests, and stamped with the name of the king and the god to whom the structure was dedicated. The workers were not slaves, but devotees, earning divine merit through their labour. They sang while they worked, hymns that helped them maintain the rhythm necessary to move the millions of bricks required, their voices rising with the structure itself. When accidents occurred, as they inevitably did with such massive construction, the victims were considered sacrifices to the foundation, their blood mixing with the mud, to strengthen the building's spiritual power. At the base of each ziggurat lay extensive temple complexes, warehouses, workshops, and administrative buildings that made these structures the economic as well as spiritual centres of their cities. The ziggurat of Ur covered an area larger than a modern city block, its associated buildings housing thousands of priests, scribes, craftsmen, and sacred servants. The wealth that flowed through these complexes was staggering. Tons of grain from temple fields, gold and silver from devotees seeking divine favour, exotic goods from merchants who tithed their profits, all carefully recorded on clay tablets that allow us to reconstruct the economy of heaven. The daily routine of a ziggurat was as precisely regulated as the movement of the stars. Before dawn, the drums would sound from the highest level, their deep thrumming travelling for miles across the flat landscape, calling the faithful to witness the daily rebirth of the world. As the first light touched the golden apex, priests would pour libations of beer and oil, the liquids running down special channels carved into the structure's face, literally feeding the ziggurat as one would feed a living being. The smoke from the morning offerings would rise in pillars that could be seen from neighbouring cities, each column of smoke a message to the gods that their earthly homes were being properly maintained. Inside the ziggurat's hollow chambers, accessible only through narrow passages that required crawling in some places, lay the most sacred spaces where the statues of the gods resided. These were not mere representations, but actual bodies that the gods could inhabit when they chose to manifest in the physical realm. The statues were carved from rare woods, covered in gold leaf, with eyes of precious stones that seemed to track viewers' movements. They were dressed in real clothing, changed according to the season and occasion, and fed actual meals that were placed before them 3 times daily. After a suitable interval for the god to consume the spiritual essence of the food, the physical remains would be distributed to the priests, who thus literally shared meals with divinity. The most restricted area was the chapel at the ziggurat's apex, where only the highest priest, and on special occasions, the king could enter. Here, the boundary between earth and heaven was at its thinnest, and mortals could, with proper preparation, actually hear the gods speaking. The chamber was small, barely large enough for 2 people to stand, its walls covered in sheets of electrum that created a golden glow even in darkness. The ceiling was painted with the map of heaven, showing the paths of the gods through the night sky, with precious stones marking the major stars. In the centre stood an altar of meteoric iron, metal that had literally fallen from heaven, on which the most sacred offerings were burned. The acoustic properties of ziggurats were deliberately engineered to enhance religious experience. Sounds made at certain points would resonate throughout the structure, amplifying and distorting in ways that seemed supernatural. Priests learned to use these acoustic sweet spots, positioning themselves so their chanted prayers would echo and overlap, creating harmonies that seemed to come from the structure itself. During major festivals, when thousands of worshippers filled the courtyards, their combined voices would set the entire ziggurat humming, a vibration that could be felt through the soles of one's feet, as if the earth itself was participating in worship. The ziggurats were also astronomical observatories, where priest astronomers tracked the movements of the planets, predicted eclipses, and calculated the precise timing of religious festivals. The correlation between the ziggurat's levels and the planetary spheres was not mere symbolism, but a functional tool for observation. From the platform at each level, different portions of the night sky could be observed without obstruction, and the geometric relationships between the levels helped in calculating celestial angles and trajectories. The knowledge gained from these observations was considered divine revelation, messages from the gods written in the movements of their celestial bodies. The calendar of gods, sacred time. Time in ancient Mesopotamia was not the uniform or mechanical progression that modern clocks measure, but a living thing, breathing with divine rhythm, punctuated by moments when the sacred erupted into the mundane world. The calendar was not merely a tool for organizing human activities, but a map of divine intentions, each month under the patronage of different gods, each day carrying its own spiritual quality that determined what actions were permissible or forbidden. To live in Mesopotamia was to navigate a temporal landscape as complex as any physical geography, where a wrong action on an inauspicious day could bring disaster, while the same action on a favorable day might secure divine blessing for generations. The year began with the spring equinox and the greatest of all festivals, the Akitu, which lasted for 12 days and literally recreated the universe. This was not celebration in the modern sense, but cosmic maintenance, an annual repair of the deteriorating order that naturally accumulated entropy throughout the year. The first days were solemn, even fearful, as the statues of the gods were removed from their temples and the cosmic order was temporarily suspended. Criminals could not be punished, contracts were void, and even the king surrendered his regalia, becoming momentarily mortal again. The city held its breath as priests reenacted the Enuma Elish, the creation epic, with the outcome genuinely uncertain until Marduk once again defeated Tiamat and re-established order. On the 4th day of Akitu, the high priest would slap the king's face in the temple of Marduk, a ritual humiliation that reminded even the most powerful mortal of his subordination to divine authority. The king would kneel and recite a negative confession, swearing he had not neglected the gods, had not destroyed temples, had not struck a subordinate in anger. If his recitation was sincere, Marduk would restore his kingship for another year. If not, the omens would reveal the god's displeasure, and the kingdom would know its ruler had lost divine favour. The tension in the temple during this ceremony was palpable, with priests watching for the slightest sign, a flickering oil lamp, a bird calling at the wrong moment, anything that might indicate the god's judgment. Each month brought its own requirements and opportunities. The month of Tashritu, corresponding to September and October, was when the veil between life and death grew thin, and families were obligated to feed their dead ancestors. Special meals were prepared and placed in offering tubes that went directly into the ground, hollow reeds, or ceramic pipes through which beer and soup could flow to the deceased. The living would speak into these tubes, updating the dead on family matters, seeking their advice, ensuring they were not forgotten, and thus would not return as vengeful spirits. The smell of these graveside offerings, mixing food aromatics with the earthy scent of freshly turned soil, became the olfactory signature of autumn. The lunar calendar required constant adjustment to maintain alignment with the solar year, and the decision to add an intercalary month was not administrative but oracular. Priests would observe the heliacal rising of certain stars, the behavior of temple animals, the patterns formed by oil poured on water, all to determine whether the gods desired an extra month that year. When such a month was declared, it existed outside normal time, a temporal anomaly where the usual rules were suspended. Children conceived during intercalary months were considered specially blessed or cursed, depending on other omens, and major decisions were postponed until regular time resumed. Within each month, certain days were marked as favourable or unfavourable for specific activities. The 7th, 14th, 21st, and 28th days were Shapatu, days of rest when certain activities were forbidden, particularly for the king and high officials. They could not eat cooked meat, change their clothes, ride in chariots, or render legal judgments. These restrictions were not arbitrary but based on the understanding that on these days, the gods were particularly attentive to human behaviour. Quick to anger at presumption, the 19th day of every month was specially dangerous, called the Day of Wrath, when Gula, goddess of healing, transformed into her destructive aspect and stalked the earth, looking for victims. The daily cycle was equally structured around divine activities. Dawn belonged to Shamash, and important contracts were signed at first light to invoke his witness. Noon, when the sun stood directly overhead and shadows disappeared, was considered a moment of cosmic balance when prayers were most likely to reach heaven. Twilight was Ishtar's hour, when the boundary between day and night, like the goddess herself, embodied transition and transformation. Night was divided into 3 watches, each governed by different constellations that were themselves deified, their movements across the sky marking not just time, but the changing of divine guards over sleeping humanity. Personal calendars were synchronized with cosmic rhythms through careful attention to birthdays, not the annual celebration modern culture knows, but the monthly return of the moon to the phase it held at one's birth. These monthly birthdays were times of spiritual vulnerability when one's personal god required special attention and offerings. Missing these observances could result in the withdrawal of divine protection, leaving the individual exposed to demons and misfortune. The wealthy maintained private priests whose primary duty was tracking these personal sacred calendars, ensuring no critical date was missed. The measurement of time itself was sacred, with water clocks in temples serving not just practical but theological functions. These devices, which measured time by the regulated flow of water through calibrated vessels, were understood as miniature models of cosmic order, the regular drip of water echoing the predictable movement of celestial bodies. The priests who maintained these clocks performed purification rituals before each adjustment, understanding that to mismeasure time was to introduce chaos into the divinely ordered universe. The sound of water dripping in temple water clocks became a kind of sacred metronome, marking not just the passage of time, but the pulse of divine intention through the temporal world. Part 6. Legacy and Influence. Echoes in Eternity, the Immortal Gods. We began with a paradox. Humanity's first cities, built when we barely had the technology to shape mud into bricks, were dedicated not to human kings or practical purposes, but to invisible beings who viewed us with cosmic indifference. Now, at the end of our journey through the divine realm of Mesopotamia, perhaps we can understand this seeming contradiction. The gods were not loved despite their terrible nature, but because of it. They embodied the forces that shaped human existence, the floods that both destroyed and fertilized, the wars that brought both death and cultural exchange, the passions that created both life and suffering. To worship them was not to seek comfort, but to acknowledge reality in all its beautiful terror, to find meaning not in divine protection, but in the courage to face divine indifference with human dignity. The death of these gods was announced many times throughout history. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BC, when the last cuneiform tablet was pressed in the 1st century AD, when the great ziggurats finally crumbled into shapeless mounds, surely then the Mesopotamian deities had breathed their last. Yet they refused to die, transforming instead, hiding their names but not their natures, in the religions that followed. The flood story of Utnapishtim became Noah's Ark, so precisely that even the detail of releasing birds to find land remained unchanged. Inanna's descent to the underworld and resurrection after 3 days became a template that echoes through multiple faiths. The idea of divine law delivered to humanity, from Hammurabi receiving justice from Shamash to Moses receiving commandments on the mountain, carries forward the Mesopotamian understanding that morality required divine authority. In the Hebrew Bible, we find not just stories, but entire theological concepts that began between the 2 rivers. The cherubim guarding Eden were the caribou of Mesopotamian temples, winged guardian spirits with human heads and animal bodies. The Tower of Babel was transparently the ziggurat of Babylon, its builder's crime not ambition, but the typically Mesopotamian fear that humans might storm heaven itself. The Book of Job, with its divine council where Satan appears as prosecutor, reproduces the Mesopotamian divine assembly where gods debated human fates. Even the concept of humanity, created from clay and divine breath, appears first in Sumerian texts, where Enki and Ninmah fashion humans from the clay of the Abzu. Our languages still carry Mesopotamian whispers. When we speak of the zodiac, we use a Greek word describing a Babylonian invention, the division of the sky into 12 houses, through which divine powers moved. Every time we divide an hour into 60 minutes, or a minute into 60 seconds, we use the Sumerian sexagesimal counting system, developed by astronomer priests, who needed to track celestial movements with precision. The word alcohol derives from the Akkadian gulu, the antimony used to make coal, that substance that darkened the eyes of gods and humans alike. Even our 7-day week, with its day of rest, echoes the Mesopotamian Shapatu, those dangerous days when the gods paid special attention to human behaviour. In modern Iraq, where ancient Mesopotamia once flourished, the old gods have not entirely departed. Fishermen on the Tigris still throw back the first fish of the day, an offering to Enki, though they may not speak his name. In the marshes of southern Iraq, the marsh Arabs build reed houses using techniques unchanged since Sumerian times, structures that could serve as models for the temples where Inanna was first worshipped. During dust storms, old women still mutter protective formulas that, stripped of their Islamic overlay, reveal incantations against the demon winds that Pazuzu once commanded. But perhaps the deepest legacy of the Mesopotamian gods lies not in specific beliefs or practices, but in the very structure of how we understand divinity. They gave us the concept of gods as personalities rather than just forces, beings with desires and fears, capable of love and rage, justice and caprice. They introduced the idea that divine will could be negotiated with, that proper rituals and offerings could influence cosmic powers, that humanity had a role to play in maintaining universal order. Most profoundly, they established the notion that suffering was not meaningless, but part of a cosmic structure, that chaos was not final, but could be repeatedly overcome through divine and human effort. The gods taught humanity that civilization itself was sacred, that law and writing, brewing and mathematics were divine gifts that separated humans from animals. When a student today struggles with algebra, they work with concepts first developed to calculate temple offerings. When lovers exchange rings in marriage, they echo the sacred marriage of Inanna and Dumuzi. When we look at the evening star, we see Venus, named for the Roman goddess who inherited Ishtar's contradictory nature. The Mesopotamian gods achieved the immortality that Gilgamesh could not. Living on, not in eternal bodies but in eternal influence, their stories and symbols woven so deeply into human consciousness that we cannot imagine a world without them. As our journey through these ancient divine realms comes to its close, we might reflect that the ziggurats, though ruined, were correct in their fundamental assertion. Heaven and earth do meet, not in brick and bitumen, but in the human imagination where gods are born, live, and transform but never truly die. The Mesopotamians knew that their gods were both absolutely real and consciously created, that divine truth and human projection were not opposites, but partners in the construction of meaning. They looked at the uncaring universe and chose to see personality, purpose, and the possibility of relationship with forces infinitely greater than themselves. It's been my privilege to walk with you through the corridors of history, to stand together in the shadow of the first gods, to hear again the stories that shaped the childhood of our species. These ancient voices, preserved in clay and carried across 5,000 years, remind us that the questions we ask about meaning, mortality, justice, and the divine are not modern anxieties but the eternal concerns that make us human. Let these ancient stories guide you to restful sleep,